A farmer walked out to his field one morning and froze. The ground was covered in deep holes, as if someone had been digging all night. At first, he thought it was animals, but when he found out who was really behind it, he felt chills run down his spine. It wasn't a vandal, not a thief. Watch until the end. Comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories. The morning began the same way it always did for Alex Turner. Long before the sun had fully climbed over the horizon, he woke out of habit rather than need, the kind of early rising that had been shaped not by alarm clocks, but by decades of soil, seasons, and quiet responsibility. The air was cool, that gentle kind of cold that promised heat later in the day, and the dew still clung to the grass in a silver coating, catching the first thin stripes of light. It was the calmest time of day, a quiet in which nothing yet demanded answers. He stepped out onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee and the familiar creak of the wooden boards under his boots, letting his eyes follow the rising light across the fields. Everything he depended on was out there. Rows of vegetables, a system of irrigation he had spent months improving, a stretch of soil that now fed more than just his family. It fed his pride too, the kind only a farmer understands. The pride of seeing something grow because your own hands made it possible. He finished the coffee, set the cup down near the door, and walked across the yard toward the field. The earth smelled as it always did in the early morning, clean, damp, quietly alive. But as soon as he reached the carrot rows, something stopped him. At first he couldn't understand what he was looking at. The line of soil ahead was no longer straight and unbroken. There were depressions in the ground, irregular shadows where sunlight struck uneven surfaces. He stepped closer, confusion sharpened into focus, and the easy rhythm of morning dissolved into a stillness that felt entirely different. There were holes, not small disturbances, not the shallow scraping of animals, but deep, clean cuts into the ground. The earth lifted out and left in neat piles beside each opening. Some were wide enough for a grown man to slip inside, some narrower, but all were at least knee-deep. The walls of the holes were surprisingly smooth and straight, carved as if by someone who knew how to dig quickly and efficiently. The dirt beside them wasn't scattered in clumps like a dog might leave, but gathered in tidy mounds as though whoever dug here cared about being quiet, not careless. Alex crouched near the closest one, testing the soil between his fingers. It was cool, free of the drying crust that formed during a long day of sun. Whatever had dug this hole had done so during the night, recently, methodically, and without being seen. He rose slowly, looking over the field. There were more, a dozen at least, spaced out in no pattern he could immediately decipher. It wasn't just the carrots. The line continued into the onions, even toward the corn patch in the back. The more he looked, the more the reality sank in. Someone had been on his land while he slept, and not by accident. His first thoughts were of animals, moles, foxes, maybe even badgers, but the holes were far too deep, too uniform, and too clean. No broken stems or claw marks, no footprints from paws, only faint shoe impressions near the edge of the field, so light they were almost unnoticeable. A human, then. Someone had stood on his land, in the dark, and worked with a tool, not their hands. He spent the next hour filling the holes as best he could, pushing the soil back in with a shovel, tamping it down, marking each place with a wooden stake so he could monitor whether they shifted. The more he filled, the more he realized how much damage had already been done. The roots of several plants had been exposed to air and broken. A whole section of drip irrigation tubing had been sliced through. The weight of the problem was no longer just confusion, it was loss. Losing a few rows of vegetables wasn't simply inconvenience. It meant fewer deliveries to the grocer in town, fewer checks coming in, another delay in paying down the loan he had taken for the new irrigation pump. He tried not to let frustration turn into anger. Farming was a life built on accepting the things you couldn't control, weather, pests, market prices. But this was different. Weather didn't dig holes in straight lines. Pests didn't turn off cameras or avoid leaving tracks. Someone had come onto his land with reason and with confidence that no one would stop them. By the time the sun had fully climbed above the barn roof, he had finished recovering the last visible hole. He leaned on the shovel, breathing hard, feeling the dull ache in his back that came not from the labor, but from the knowledge that it might all be undone again by morning. The idea sat inside his chest like a stone. He needed answers. What was happening, who was doing it, and why his field of all places? He spent the late morning repairing the cut irrigation line, kneeling in the dirt to strip, reconnect, and flush the system. As he worked, he kept turning the same thought over. No tracks, no noise, no tools left behind. Whoever had come here wasn't careless. They had purpose. That was the part that unnerved him more than anything, the sense of intention. When the repairs were done, he walked the fence line surrounding his property, looking for a break, a loose board, a sign of forced entry. Nothing. The gate latches were untouched, the locks unbroken. Whoever came in hadn't needed to damage anything to get through. They knew how to move quietly, how to come and go without leaving a trail. That fact alone narrowed the possibilities in a way he didn't like. Teenagers out for trouble wouldn't bother being careful. Thieves would have stolen equipment, not dug holes. Someone was searching for something, and they believed it was buried here. He went inside only long enough to grab an old notebook from a drawer and a roll of measuring tape from the shelf. Then he went back out and began marking each site, measuring the distance between holes, sketching positions, a habit left over from the early years when he still took notes about everything he planted. It wasn't long before he noticed a pattern, not random, not the wandering line of an animal, but staggered spacing, almost like a grid, a search pattern. Someone was probing the soil in a deliberate way, and whatever they were looking for wasn't vegetables. The realization didn't come all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last. If this was a search, then it wasn't finished. They would come back. They would keep digging until they found whatever it was they believed lay beneath the earth. And if they had returned once, with such precision and silence, there was nothing to stop them from returning again tonight. The thought made the field feel different. Not a place of growth, but a place someone else had already claimed a hidden interest in. By the time evening shadows stretched long across the soil, he had a plan forming. He would not spend another morning walking out into the unknown. He would not allow himself to be one step behind. There would be no confrontation yet. He didn't know who or what he was dealing with, but he would watch. He would wait. He would see them with his own eyes. He checked the batteries in an old motion camera he once used for coyotes near the chicken coop. Mounted it on a fence post, angled toward the lower rows, but he didn't trust the camera alone. Not now. Not after seeing how careful the intruder had been. So he gathered what he needed, a heavy jacket, a thermos, a flashlight he wouldn't turn on unless he had to, and found a spot near the tree line where the land dipped just enough to give him cover without blocking his view. As the last light faded and the sky turned violet, he felt something he hadn't in years. Not fear exactly, but alertness, the sharp kind that comes before a storm. The field lay quiet, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. He waited, knowing that whoever had dug here the night before might be out there already, watching just as silently. The first hole had been just a disruption in the soil. Now it was the beginning of something he could not yet name. And in the silence of that settling night, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Tomorrow morning, the field would either look the same or look worse. But tonight, for the first time, he would be ready to see the truth with his own eyes. The next morning confirmed what Alex already suspected, though part of him had held on to a thin hope that he was wrong. The holes had returned, more of them. The ones he had filled the day before were untouched, but a new line had appeared farther down the field, cutting into the lettuce beds and continuing in a slow, deliberate curve toward the edge of the corn rows. Whoever was doing this was not guessing. They were working with intention, shifting direction as though the earth itself were a map only they could read. And just as before, the soil had been lifted neatly out, not scattered, not disturbed by claws or paws, but shaped by hands that knew how to work fast in silence. He walked the length of the new damage, noting the depth with the same uneasy fascination he had felt the day before. Each one was nearly identical, just over 2 feet deep, the wall straight, the bottom flat. Not a single one was shallow or abandoned midway through, which meant the digger wasn't rushing, wasn't afraid of being caught, or simply didn't care. There was a rhythm to the placement. It was the kind of pattern that didn't belong to instinct or impulse, but to procedure. The first feeling that rose in him wasn't anger. It was the strange, hollow quiet of being forced to acknowledge a truth he didn't yet understand. He wasn't dealing with vandalism. He wasn't dealing with children. Someone had been moving across his land night after night with a plan, and that meant the holes were not the story, they were evidence of the story. The cause still lay buried. By the time he had finished inspecting the last hole, the sun was high enough to burn away whatever coolness dawn had offered, and the air hung thickly still over the field. He returned to the house for tools, retrieving the same notebook he had used the day before, along with a tape measure, a carpenter's pencil, and a battered ruler, the kind he used when planning planting rows in spring. There was comfort in measurement. It turned confusion into something that could be held, seen, arranged. He moved from hole to hole, writing down distances, mapping positions relative to fixed points. The irrigation line, the fence corner, the old mulberry tree near the far end of the field. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but he knew that things created with intention left behind patterns. Randomness never repeated itself, but intentions did. Once the data was on paper, he crouched in the shade of the tractor shed, tracing lines and angles with the tip of the pencil. It wasn't perfect geometry, but the placements weren't random either. The holes were not forming one straight line, but several staggered rows, as though someone were sweeping the field in sections, searching not near the surface but deeper. He drew a crude grid, plotting the holes as dots, and watched as the picture became clearer. They were checking the land methodically, calculating distances, narrowing a search. The realization tightened something in his chest. This wasn't exploration, it was confirmation. Whoever was doing this believed that something was buried, something worth coming back for. The idea had seemed almost absurd the day before, too melodramatic to accept. But now, with a second morning of fresh holes and a pattern forming before his eyes, he could no longer dismiss it. Someone believed there was something hidden in his soil, something that didn't belong to farming, something they were certain still lay waiting. He stood and walked the perimeter of the field again, slower this time, not searching for broken fences but for anything out of place. Boot scuffs in the dust, discarded flashlight batteries, scraps of clothing. There was almost nothing, only a slight depression in the grass near the rear gate where someone had stood more than once, and a faint dry line in the dirt where something heavy had been dragged or laid down briefly. The signs weren't accidental. They were cautious. Whatever man was doing this had done it before. Not here, perhaps, but somewhere. A lifetime of calculated movement had built habits into his muscles. He did not leave trash. He did not leave carelessness. He worked as if being watched even when he wasn't. That was when the camera came back to mind. He walked to the fence post where he had mounted it and found exactly what he expected. The lens was turned away, tilted toward the ground, not by wind or accident, but by a hand. Someone had noticed it, reached for it, and moved it. The camera had recorded nothing because the man had made sure nothing would be recorded. Alex let out a slow breath, feeling something shift inside him. Not fear, not yet, but a sharp understanding that he was not dealing with a trespasser who panicked and fled. The man who dug these holes worked calmly, without haste, without fear of interruption. He knew how to enter and how to leave without being heard. That meant skill, training maybe, someone with a past. He spent the next hour in the shed, going through supplies he hadn't touched in years, an old hunting flashlight, a set of field binoculars, a long unused thermos, gloves. Not because he planned to confront anyone yet, but because he could no longer pretend this would simply stop. The first night he had stayed inside. The second night he had been outside, but hidden and still. The next night, he told himself, he wouldn't stay in the shadows. He needed to see the man up close, understand him, not as a threat, but as a puzzle. The thought came with resistance. He didn't want to be part of whatever this was. He wanted to farm, to repair the cuts in the irrigation, to think only about soil pH and crop rotation. But someone else had written him into a different story, and there was no way to step back out of it. His land was no longer just his responsibility. It had become someone else's obsession. That afternoon, he visited two neighbors under the pretense of borrowing equipment. Both lived close enough to see his fields from their own porches, and both were the kind of people who noticed movement in the dark without making a production of it. He didn't ask directly about intruders, no mention of holes, no mention of sabotage, but his casual questions told him something important. No one had heard dogs barking during the night. No one had seen lights floating across the field. No vehicles had passed on the back road. The trespasser was either entering from an angle no one watched, or he was entering on foot, silently, with a confidence that bordered on ritual. It wasn't reassuring, but it ruled out amateurs. That evening, when Alex returned home, he walked the field one last time before the light was gone. He paused by the farthest hole, staring at it as if it might answer him. Someone had stood in this very spot, under the same sky, on the same earth, just hours before. Someone who had not hesitated, not doubted, not wondered whether they were allowed to be here. Whoever he was, the man believed he had a right or a duty to dig. Alex didn't know if the man was dangerous, but he knew one thing now. The man was not done. He would return. So when the last of the sunlight drained out of the day and night took the field, Alex set up again in the same place he had waited before, but this time with a steadier purpose. He wasn't simply watching for a trespasser. He was studying a pattern, a mind, a reason. He didn't know that the night ahead would be different from the last one. He only knew that he would not blink first. When the darkness deepened and the crickets began their long, unbroken chorus, the field once again looked like an ordinary place, quiet, harmless, waiting. But Alex no longer believed in the surface of things. He knew now that the ground could be full of secrets, and somewhere out there, someone was determined to dig them up. The third night was different from the previous two in ways Alex didn't immediately recognize but felt. The air carried a stillness that was not the usual quiet of a sleeping field, but something watchful, something holding itself just out of sight. He settled into the same hiding place near the tree line. But this time he was not only waiting, he was ready. His breathing had slowed into a steady rhythm, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and his mind was no longer circling questions, but preparing for answers. The field in front of him looked unchanged, but he knew that was only the surface. Somewhere in that darkness, a man was already deciding where to make the next hole. The first sign of him did not come as a sound, but as a faint shift in the quality of darkness, a movement just slightly darker than the night around it. A thin beam of warm, muted light flickered on and off, not sweeping like a searchlight, but aimed deliberately downward. Not the wild, uncertain beam of someone nervous or hurried, but the controlled light of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and how much he needed to see. The man wasn't trying to light the field. He was trying to avoid lighting anything he didn't have to. Alex watched the figure come into clearer definition as he crossed the lower end of the field. The man moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this many times. His steps were slow but firm, never tentative, never dragging. He wore dark clothes, not new but well kept, practical rather than fashionable. The outline of his jacket suggested pockets weighted by tools. The way he walked told Alex something he hadn't expected to understand so quickly. This man didn't feel like a trespasser. He felt like someone who believed he belonged here. When the man reached the first marked location, he didn't pause to look around. He knelt as though continuing a task left unfinished, pulled something from a satchel at his side, and placed it on the ground. In the dim, angled light, Alex could see the object, a folded, weathered piece of paper, stiff with age, something like a map or chart. The man opened it, smoothing it out with the familiarity of ritual, not curiosity. He studied it for only a moment before putting it aside. Whatever he needed to see was already memorized. Then he began to dig. He didn't use a full shovel, but a compact military-style tool, sharp-edged, collapsible, and designed for precision. The blade cut cleanly into the earth, slicing downward in straight lines. He worked in silence, the only sound the faint scrape of metal against soil. He didn't dig in wide arcs or throw dirt carelessly over his shoulder. Instead, he placed each cut of soil carefully onto a square of tarp he had spread beside him. He wasn't unearthing the ground. He was peeling it back. Alex watched every movement, entranced not by the act itself, but by the way it was done. The man was not searching for valuables. He wasn't probing at roots or prying for objects. He was clearing the earth the way someone might brush dust from a grave marker, deliberately, reverently, as though disturbing anything beneath might be dangerous. Now and then, the man stopped, hovered motionless, then leaned down and listened, with his ear close to the exposed soil. It was not the listening of a man waiting for noise. It was the listening of someone trying to detect something beneath the silence, a vibration, a presence, a memory. The rhythm of the work was what finally made the truth settle in Alex's mind. The spacing of the holes, the methodical digging, the inspection, the map, the listening. The man wasn't searching for something hidden. He was checking for something dangerous. And he was doing it the way someone trained to deal with explosives would. That realization sat cold and sharp in Alex's stomach. Whoever this man was, he wasn't acting out of carelessness or mischief. He had a purpose he believed in, and that purpose was rooted in fear. Not of getting caught, but of failing to finish what he'd started. The man finished the hole and lowered his hand carefully into it, feeling the bottom, pressing gently into the soil. There was no satisfaction or disappointment in his movements, only confirmation. Then he began to refill it, packing the dirt back into place with a strange kind of precision, as though sealing something back inside rather than undoing his own work. Only then did Alex notice the other detail, subtle but unmistakable. The man always stood up slowly, never turning his back to the hole until the last of the soil was returned, as if something beneath was still dangerous until covered. It no longer made sense to think of the holes as a search for treasure or contraband. This was something else entirely. Something shaped by training, duty, and memory. The man wasn't digging for something. He was eliminating a possibility, one hole at a time. Alex remained silent, even when the man moved closer, close enough now that Alex could see the hardened, weathered lines of his face when the light caught at an angle. Not young, not old, middle-aged, but worn in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with burden. His expression wasn't tense. It was focused, disciplined, and beneath it was something heavier, something like grief. He watched the man work through 2 more holes before quietly folding the tarp, securing tools and gathering the paper map with the kind of care usually reserved for objects pulled from a casket. When he finally walked back toward the far end of the field, he did so without hesitation, without looking over his shoulder. He had not acted like a man on someone else's land. He had acted like a man carrying out a duty that only he believed still mattered. Alex didn't move until long after the man had disappeared into the dark. When he finally stood, his legs felt stiff, but not from the cold, from the understanding settling into him like a weight. Whoever that man was, he wasn't finished. He would be back again, and he was not acting out of malice. He was acting out of memory. Alex walked back toward the house under the thick silence of the night, knowing that the next step wasn't trying to stop the digging. It was trying to understand the digger. The holes were not the threat. The secret behind them was. And Alex now understood that he hadn't stumbled into a mystery. He had walked into the aftermath of someone else's war. Morning came with a different kind of weight than before. The field no longer felt like a place being damaged, but a place being investigated, almost like Alex wasn't the owner anymore, but a witness to something that had started long before he ever planted a single seed here. He moved through the lower rows, not to assess new damage this time, but to study the man's work with fresh eyes. There were 3 new holes precisely where he had watched the stranger dig, and now that he had seen him up close, his posture, his silence, the way he listened to the earth, the holes seemed less like violations and more like remnants of a duty that hadn't ended when the uniform came off. The soil was packed down smooth, almost level with the ground, as if the man had never wanted to be discovered, as if the holes were not meant to exist beyond the moment he needed them. That alone told Alex something important. The intruder was not trying to leave a message. He was trying to erase one. The fragile calm of realization pushed Alex towards something he had been avoiding. He could no longer pretend the man was just a trespasser. He needed to understand who he was and why he believed this land mattered. The only way to do that was to find people who might know him. So he left the field and drove into town, parking by the old general store where the morning regulars gathered for tobacco, newspapers, and pieces of gossip disguised as conversation. He didn't enter asking directly about holes in his field or men digging at night. He knew that would only lead to stories, not facts. So he listened instead, stood where the men lingered outside, leaning against trucks and swapping news. He waited for a lull in the talk and then mentioned something small, something harmless. A quiet man he'd seen around lately, possibly a newcomer, maybe renting a place near the edge of town. It didn't take long for someone to offer a name. "That'd be the fellow staying out by the Miller property," one of the older men said, pointing with his chin like it was a direction on a map. "Keeps to himself, doesn't say much, walks like he's looking past whatever's in front of him." Someone else added that he rarely bought anything more than canned food, black tea, and batteries. Someone else mentioned they'd seen him fixing an old fence post by hand with more patience than sense. Nobody knew where he came from. They only knew he hadn't always been here. The information wasn't deep, but it was a thread, enough to follow. That afternoon, Alex stopped by the small clinic on the South Road, under the pretense of renewing a prescription for muscle pain. The doctor, a quiet woman who'd practiced there for 20 years, answered most questions with polite brevity until he casually mentioned the same detail he'd used in town. A man who seemed new around here, who kept to himself, seemed withdrawn. Her eyes changed just slightly, not with concern, but recognition. She didn't give a name not without permission, not in her position, but she did say something that made Alex understand the first real piece of the truth. "He's not dangerous," she said carefully, "just someone who returned from something he never really came back from." Those words settled heavily in the air. They said enough without saying anything specific. Alex knew then that the man had served in the military, and more than that, he had carried something home with him, something invisible but heavy enough to bend his posture, make his eyes restless, drive him into the fields at night to dig for dangers that no longer existed. Back on the road, Alex drove past the Miller property, no house in sight from where he was, just the edge of a shed, a parked bicycle, and a clothesline with a single shirt hung neatly in the wind. He didn't stop. He wasn't ready yet to confront the man directly, and he wouldn't do it from the side of the road like a sheriff serving papers. He needed to understand more. Why this land? Why these spots? Why now? That night he returned to the notebook, redrawing the grid of the holes, adding the new ones. The pattern was clearer now. A careful sweep of the land in narrow sections, the kind a bomb squad might use when clearing an unsafe zone. And that was when it finally came together, not as speculation, but as something he now believed with certainty. The man was not looking for treasure, he was looking for mines. Maybe not literally, not active explosives buried beneath his field, but something in his mind had never left a battlefield. He dug because he believed he had to, because every undisturbed patch of earth was a possible threat, because somewhere something in him still lived on a line between life and death, where the smallest patch of land could kill a man who stepped too quickly. The next realization came with a quiet heaviness. There was no way to stop a man like that by force. You didn't argue a memory out of someone. You didn't fence it out. You didn't threaten it away. If Alex called the police now, if he demanded charges or pressed trespassing complaints, he wouldn't be solving the problem. He'd be throwing a wounded man into a system that didn't know what to do with the kind of wounds that didn't bleed. So instead of calling anyone, he made a choice that surprised even him. He decided to meet the man not as an enemy, but as someone trying to understand why another man's war had come to rest inside his farmland. He didn't sleep easily that night, not because of fear, but because he could no longer pretend this was just a property issue. The holes were no longer the problem. They were the symptom of something much deeper, older and more painful than he had ever imagined. By morning, the decision had settled into him fully. He was no longer looking for a way to stop the digging. He was looking for a way to reach the digger. The holes in the ground were easy to fill. The holes in a man were not. But someone had to try. The decision to approach the man did not come with bravery only with clarity. Something in Alex had shifted during those days of watching the field change shape against his will. The anger that might have come if the intruder had been a thief or a vandal was gone. What replaced it was something harder to ignore. The sense that the man was not trying to harm anyone, only trying to prevent a harm that existed now only in his memory. And once Alex understood that, it became impossible to respond to the digging as though it were just a crime. Still, knowing what he ought to do and knowing how to do it were two different things. He spent that morning walking the field not because he expected new holes, but because he needed to think in motion. The soil, still soft from recent disturbance, carried the shape of the man's hands, the memory of where his boots had pressed. It was strange how much presence could be left behind by someone who moved like a ghost. Even now in daylight, Alex could picture the man kneeling, listening to the ground like a doctor checking a pulse. Not searching, checking, confirming the absence of danger in a world where danger had once been everywhere. He walked back toward the house, past the shed, past the familiar tools hanging on nails, past the quiet routine of his life, and felt something he hadn't felt since that first morning. The field was no longer just a place he worked. It had become a place where someone else's burden was being carried, silently, night after night. He was not sure when responsibility had been handed to him, but it had happened. And now the choice wasn't just whether to stop the man, but whether to let him remain alone in the kind of darkness no person could survive in forever. The first attempt to speak to him didn't happen in the field, but in town. Alex waited outside the general store, not because he expected the man to walk by, but because he wanted to understand how a conversation might even begin. He practiced lines in his mind the way a man might rehearse a speech before a funeral, awkwardly, knowing nothing would sound right when spoken aloud. How did you address a stranger who believed he was preventing deaths? How did you tell him the danger was gone without insulting the wound that made him believe it still existed? He found no answer, only the growing certainty that if he hesitated any longer, the man would keep digging until the entire field was carved up, row by row, season after season. It wasn't a matter of crops anymore. It was a matter of whether he would allow a man to live inside a nightmare unchallenged. So the next evening, instead of hiding at the tree line, Alex stood in the open, near the last set of holes. No flashlight, no shovel, no tools. Just the quiet posture of someone who was not preparing for a fight. The moon was thin, but bright enough to show the rows of soil like long, dark ribs stretching across the land. He waited, and as time thickened, he wondered if he had misjudged the night, the pattern, the certainty. But then the faint glow appeared again, a small circle of light moving steadily across the ground, not scanning, but selecting. The man walked the same path as before, following a mental grid no one else could see. He did not notice Alex at first. His focus was entirely on the earth. Only when he knelt did he stop, sensing in the stillness something unfamiliar. Another presence. He turned toward Alex, not startled but alert, like a soldier whose instincts had never retired. His hand did not go for the tool at his side, but his body held a readiness that could not be trained out of a man, only buried beneath years of silence. The two stood facing each other in the hush of the field, neither speaking, the darkness between them thick as unturned soil. Alex was the one to bridge it. "I'm not here to stop you," he said, his voice even, not loud, not commanding. "I just want to understand." The man didn't answer, but something in his shoulders eased. Not trust, but recognition that no threat was present. His eyes, dimmer than the flashlight he carried, did not carry hostility, only distance, as though they had been turned inward for so long they were uncertain how to look outward again. "I've seen you working," Alex continued, "and I know you're not doing this to destroy anything. You're looking for something, or making sure something isn't here." Still no reply. But the man didn't turn away, didn't walk off into the dark. That was enough of an opening to continue. "This land's been farmed for 40 years, Alex said gently. "Nothing's ever been buried out here that could hurt anyone. Not in the way you're looking for." The man's expression didn't change, but his hand moved slowly to the folded paper in his jacket. He took it out and held it for a moment before unfolding it under the faint beam of the flashlight. It wasn't a map of the farm. It wasn't even a local survey. It was a military grid, coordinates and markings, Symbols and circles drawn by hand, worn by time, by being folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had become pale scars across the paper. "This is where it was," the man said finally, his voice rough as gravel, as though unused to speaking. "Our unit cleared most of it, but the last stretch, we didn't finish. Can't leave it unfinished." It was not the words that struck Alex, but the tone, the way he said "we," as though speaking for men who were no longer alive. The way he said "finish," as though the war hadn't ended, only paused. He wasn't correcting a mistake in the world. He was correcting a mistake in time. "What was it?" Alex asked quietly. "Mines?" The man nodded once. No embellishment, just the truth as he understood it. "And you think the last ones might be here?" Another nod. His grip on the map tightened slightly, as if the paper were the only proof he still had of something real. "They're not here," Alex said softly. "I know this land, every inch. Nothing's ever exploded here. Nothing's ever come up in the plow, or the rain, or the drainage. You don't have to keep looking." The man didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. That was when Alex understood the true depth of the problem. The danger wasn't underground. It was in the man. A danger carved into memory, not soil. A danger that couldn't be dug up or filled in. "You don't have to stop," Alex said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Something changed then, not dramatically, not visibly, but like the quiet shifting of weight from one foot to another. The man was still caught between where he had been and where he stood now, but he was no longer looking through Alex. He was looking at him. "I'm not trying to get rid of you," Alex continued. "I just want to help you walk in the world that's here now, not the one that's gone." Those words were not the end of anything. They weren't even a solution, but they were an invitation. A lifeline extended not to drag someone out of darkness, but to stand beside them long enough for them to decide they didn't have to live there forever. The man finally lowered the flashlight. The soil was left unturned that night. The map was folded away. And when he walked off the field, he didn't disappear into the dark like a ghost escaping light. He walked like someone who had not been chased, like someone who had been seen. Alex did not know what would come next, only that the field would not be the same. The story was no longer about holes. It was about whether a man could stop digging into the earth once someone helped him start digging his way back to the surface. The farm was quiet again when Alex returned to the house. But the quiet felt different now. Not the quiet before danger, but the quiet before change. And change, like healing, begins slowly, one night at a time. The next days unfolded not with sudden breakthroughs or dramatic changes, but with a kind of gradual softening like winter soil, thawing layer by layer, slowly enough that you almost miss the moment when it no longer resists the shovel. The man Alex had met in the field did not return the next night to dig, nor the one after that. The darkness over the land remained undisturbed, no fresh holes, no sign of quiet labor in the hours when most men slept. At first, Alex wasn't sure whether that absence meant progress or withdrawal. But on the third morning, he saw movement near the fence line, not the familiar crouched figure with a shovel, but the same man standing in daylight, hands empty, posture uncertain, as though waiting for permission to exist in the open. Alex didn't approach him immediately. He gave him space, just as he would have with a skittish animal that had known only hardship and alarms. The man kept his head down, scanning the rows not for danger now, but for something else. Perhaps the proof that the ground really was safe, that the world he feared was not hidden beneath the surface after all. Only when he looked up did Alex walk out to him, careful not to move too fast, careful not to take away the dignity of a man unused to help. "You're back," Alex said, not as a question, but as acknowledgement. The man nodded once. He wasn't carrying the old map. He wasn't wearing the field jacket weighed down with tools and memories. He looked smaller without them, not physically, but as though he had set down a piece of himself and hadn't yet learned how to stand after the weight was gone. "I didn't finish," he said quietly. "I never finished that last sector." "I know," Alex answered, "but maybe the finishing isn't in the digging anymore." There was no reply, but there was a pause, one that meant the man was thinking instead of bracing. That was when Alex made the first real offer. Not a demand, not an instruction, just a place to begin. I could use help around the farm, he said. Work that needs hands, not digging, fencing, repairs, checking irrigation lines. Quiet jobs, ones that need patience. The man didn't accept immediately, but he didn't refuse. He stared at the rows of crops for a long time before speaking again. I'm not good with people, he said flatly, as if warning him away before disappointment could form. That's fine, Alex replied. I'm not asking you to be. Something eased in the silence that followed. Not trust, not yet, but the first step toward it. The man stayed that morning, helping Alex lift a warped fence board back into place. He worked the way he dug, methodically, with care, with a precision that did not waste movement. Not once did he ask what needed fixing next. He found the problem before Alex said anything, saw the weak joint before it cracked. A man who once listened for the threat of buried explosives now listened for the imperfections in wood grain and wire tension. Over the next week, he came back again. Not on a schedule, not with certainty, but with effort. Alex learned his name, Peter, and learned that names meant little to a man who had lived so long inside a version of reality, defined not by who he was, but by who he used to be. What mattered more was how he moved through the days now. He no longer walked the field with a map. He walked it with tools meant to build, not unearth. Some mornings he worked in silence beside Alex. Some mornings he left early when something in him grew restless. But each time he returned to the field in daylight, it was a small victory. Not for Alex, but for the life Peter was slowly remembering how to stand inside. Meanwhile, the land itself began to recover. The places where holes had once interrupted the neat order of the rows were replanted, mulched, watered. Soil settled back into place. New sprouts appeared. There was no sign left of the digging except what Alex carried in memory, because some scars belonged more to the witness than to the earth. The neighbors, who had once watched the farm with quiet curiosity, now saw Peter in town sometimes, buying nails instead of batteries, wood instead of canned food. They didn't know the story, but they sensed the change. People who once crossed the street to avoid the stranger now nodded to him, not in welcome necessarily, but in recognition that he was no longer a shadow circling the edge of their town. It was only when the clinic called to confirm the appointment Alex had arranged quietly, through a contact who understood trauma better than talk, that Peter finally agreed to let someone beyond the farm step into the story. He didn't say yes because he trusted the world. He said yes because someone had shown him a reason to try. The day he left for the appointment, he didn't say he was going. He simply didn't show up at the farm, and when he returned the next day, he worked in silence. But the silence was different, less like an armor, more like a pause in a sentence not yet finished. Things didn't resolve into perfection. Healing did not turn Peter into a man who laughed loudly or told stories about his past. He still checked the ground now and then, resting a hand against the soil in moments when old memories flickered back to life. But he no longer dug. He listened, then stood up again, reassured not by the silence of the earth, but by the presence of someone beside him who understood why listening mattered in the first place. By late summer, the holes were gone. The field was whole again, though Alex never forgot where they had been. He began to see them not as scars, but as reminders, places where another man's buried fear had briefly surfaced, only to be met not with punishment, but with patience. And one evening, as the sun lowered behind the barn and the air turned gold around the rows of sprouting leaves, Alex realized something he hadn't understood before. The field had not been the one in danger. The man had. The digging had only been a language, a way of speaking to a past that refused to die quietly. And what saved him was not being stopped, but being met. Not being told to leave, but being given somewhere to stay. Peter still walked the land sometimes at dusk, but now he carried a tool belt instead of a shovel. He no longer checked the soil for death. He checked it for moisture, for the sound roots made when healthy plants shifted in the breeze. He no longer moved like a man expecting an explosion beneath his feet. He moved like someone learning, slowly and quietly, that the earth could hold life instead of danger. And Alex, watching him from the porch the same way he once watched the holes multiply in the morning light, understood the truest part of the story. The field had not just grown crops that season, it had grown a man back into the world, not because it was peaceful land, but because someone had finally stayed long enough to remind him where peace begins. Not underground, but in the hands of another human being, willing to reach out and say, "You don't have to finish this alone." The holes in the soil had been easy to fill. The holes in a man took longer, but they could be filled too. And that was the real harvest, the one no ledger could measure, the one that turned a farm into a place where two lives grew side by side, one from the earth, one back toward the light. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next one. Leave a comment, share this video with a friend, and I'll see you in the next episode.